A mother and her 4 children vanished into the blizzard. What she ran from was more terrifying than the cold. On Red Mountain Pass, where the wind bites like a whip, a woman clutching her baby and leading 3 little ones disappears into the blizzard, running from something colder than snow. Folks never asked what she fled, only saw her eyes clouded and bruised. When a stranger opened his cabin door to them in the storm, it wasn't welcome, but a silent mercy. But in these wild lands, can a new name and a borrowed roof keep old wounds from bleeding through? The snow cut like knives along Red Mountain, the wind a living thing that clawed at skin and hope alike. Clara May Hart, thin as shadow, staggered through the drifts with Caleb tucked tight against her breast, the baby's breath too small to see but enough to keep her walking. Behind her trailed 3 boys, Ollie red-cheeked and blinking back tears, Jesse and Noah, twins with hair wild as rabbits, trudging single file to hide from the wind. The sky pressed low and gray, squeezing color from the world until all that remained was bone white and the sting of blood in her mouth. Their boots weren't boots anymore, but wet rags knotted over frozen toes. The milk can was empty. She'd scraped it for snow, hoping it'd melt to water, but Caleb's lips were cracked and blue, and Ollie's cough rattled in the trees behind them. Clara's hands, purple with old bruises and new, clung to the baby so hard she left prints that wouldn't fade by spring. They moved with the instinct of animals chased from fire, silent, desperate, half wild in the teeth of winter. Somewhere below, the dogs began to bark. She heard them, distant at first, then closer, a hot, ragged sound that stitched her spine straight and set her legs moving even when they screamed for rest. She'd lost count of days since she'd run, only the ache of old wounds and the memory of Roy Carter's breath behind her to measure the distance from her old life. Roy, with his fists and his whiskey and his whispered threats in the dark, he'd said she was his always, and the world seemed to agree. Now the world was nothing but cold and pine and a loneliness so deep it hurt to breathe. A branch cracked in the woods. She spun, gathering her brood close, every muscle coiled for flight. Jesse whimpered, and Clara shushed him with a hand that trembled. She'd taught them all how to be silent, how to become snow, become stone. But the baby wouldn't keep quiet. His little wail scraped the stillness raw, and for a moment she saw herself tossing him down the slope, anything to keep the noise from bringing worse. Guilt burned through her like whiskey, sharp and hot, and she pressed him closer. That's when she saw the figure, broad-shouldered, motionless in the trees, a man cut from the same earth that made the mountains. Frost clung to his beard, his coat dusted white. He did not lift his axe or speak. He just watched, eyes the pale color of river ice. Clara almost bolted. She knew men, knew how little they needed to show their worst. But he just stood there, the cold making a statue of him, until she felt the tremor in her knees outlast her fear. He turned, without hurry, and walked toward a huddle of logs half lost in the snow. A line cabin she hadn't seen. He pushed the door open and waited, saying nothing. The wind howled behind her, and somewhere below, the dogs howled back. Clara gathered her children and followed, heart pounding in her throat. The warmth inside struck her like a blow, smoke and pine and bread. She sank down just inside the threshold, knees buckling. The man, Elias Boone, crossed to the hearth and stoked the fire, wordless as stone. Caleb's wailing faded at last. For the first time in years, Clara let herself close her eyes. For one breath, they were safe. Outside, the wind shifted, and far off, the dogs found the new scent and turned uphill. Somewhere on the ridge, Roy Carter's eyes narrowed, and the hunt began again. The cabin's walls were thick, made from logs squared with the marks of a broad axe. Inside, the air was heavy with pine and smoke and the sweet, ghostly memory of bread-baked days ago. Boone moved through the space without words, big hands steady as he hung a battered pot over the fire, dropping beans and a chunk of salt pork inside. He didn't look at Clara, not for long, but she could feel the weight of his presence. It wasn't threat, it was something like weather, an ache in the bones, silent and predictable. She pulled her children to her side, tucking Caleb in the crook of her arm, watching Ollie and the twins huddle together on a rough wool blanket. Her hands shook. She tried to hide it, but the smallest boy saw and pressed himself into her skirts. Boone knelt by the stove, carving quietly, the curl of wood shaving to the floor, and without thinking, he handed Ollie a horse he'd whittled in 3 strokes, as if he'd done it 1,000 times. Ollie's eyes went wide. For a while, no one spoke. The wind battered the windows, and snow creaked on the roof. Clara kept glancing at the door, half expecting a fist to hammer through it, half ready to run if it did. The children ate like wolves, swallowing beans with their hands, not waiting for them to cool. Boone ladled soup into Clara's bowl and set it before her with the same wordless patience. She wanted to ask what he wanted, what price would come after the warmth, the food. But when she finally looked up, she found only tired kindness in his eyes, a sort of worn-out decency, the look of a man who knew what hunger was and didn't judge another for showing it. Night fell slow, thick as molasses. The storm pressed in, but the cabin held. Boone checked the shutters, nailed a hide over the cracks in the window, and threw more logs on the fire. He gave each of the boys a wool shirt from a chest at the foot of his bed and laid a buffalo robe on the floor for them to sleep. When Clara tucked Caleb against her chest, her heart beating wild beneath his head, Boone finally spoke, voice low and flat. "You want to know why I helped you?" he asked, eyes on the fire. She hesitated, unsure if she wanted the answer, but something in her, maybe the last scrap of faith, made her whisper, "Yes." He nodded once as if she'd proven a point. "I don't leave folks to freeze, not out here, not ever." That was all. He didn't ask her name or her story, didn't press about the bruises or the scars or the fear still hitching every breath. He went to his bunk, lay down with his back to the room, and slept with his boots on. Clara lay awake a long while, watching shadows shift on the log walls, counting the breaths of her children, feeling the weight of silence thicken but not suffocate. The wind rattled but couldn't get in. She let her eyes close at last and dreamed of nothing at all. Beneath the cabin eaves, the snow began to slide off in heavy sheets, and out beyond the yard, in the trees, a single set of boot prints melted slow, headed back toward the pass. Morning on Red Mountain was never gentle. Light broke through the window in long, cold stripes, lighting up dust and frost all at once. Clara woke to the quiet hush of Boone splitting wood just outside the cabin. The sound, steady, measured, was oddly comforting, not the crash of anger she'd known in other men, but a rhythm she could almost trust. She sat up, careful not to disturb Caleb sleeping against her, and watched the boys tangled together on the buffalo robe, their small faces slack with real sleep. Her back ached as she moved. She pressed a palm to her ribs, feeling the ridges of old bruises, some yellowed and fading, others still purple and sore. She tugged her collar up to hide the marks, a habit learned so deep it came without thought. The children stirred, drawn by the smell of frying cornmeal. Boone had returned, snow still clinging to his boots, face flushed from the cold. He set a skillet on the coals, his movements quiet but never secretive. As the meal cooked, Clara hung their wet socks by the fire, glancing now and then at the man who had let strangers into his home without question. She found herself waiting for the price. A question, a touch, some expectation to be paid. But Boone just handed her a battered cup of coffee, the heat of it grounding her to the moment. The silence between them was not heavy, just wide and untouched, like new snow. Rumors floated on the wind in these mountains, and Clara had heard Boone's story even before she'd seen his face. Folks in the mining camp said he'd lost his wife and child to the blizzard 2 winters back, that since then he kept to himself, spent more time with trees and mules than with people. They said his cabin was haunted by loss, but that his word was solid. He'd never turned away a hungry soul, no matter how ragged. The days passed in the quiet drag of waiting. The storm outside showed no sign of easing. Boone carved toys for the boys, horses and little bears, all whittled from pine knots, and stacked firewood higher around the door. Clara washed the boys' shirts in the melted snow, her knuckles raw, back bent over a tin basin. She moved like a woman under water, startled at every sound, flinching when Boone's boots creaked on the planks. One afternoon she dropped a cup and froze, heart hammering, half expecting a shout, a blow, something old and ugly to rise from the corners. Boone only knelt, picked up the cup, and set it on the table. "Nothing broken," he said, voice quiet as river gravel. That evening he placed a ring of willow wood on the table beside her supper. It was rough, still green in places, shaped by hands unskilled but honest. He spoke with his eyes on the grain of the wood, not meeting hers. "I don't have fine words," Boone said, his voice thick, "but if you need another name, you can have mine." Clara stared at the ring, her throat too tight to answer. She pressed her fingers to her lips, fighting tears she'd thought burned out years before. Boone said nothing more. He let her decide. When the sun went down and the shadows grew long on the snow, Clara slid the ring onto her finger. There were no vows, no prayers, only the hush of wind at the window and the slow, careful trust of 2 lives battered but not yet broken. Outside, Roy Carter's dogs circled the ridge, catching the scent of safety and hate in equal measure. In the heart of the cabin, Clara's wound did not heal, but it stopped bleeding for the first time. The new name felt strange in Clara's mouth. She wrote it on a scrap of sackcloth with the stub of a pencil. Clara Boone. Her handwriting trembled, the letters running together like the thaw after a hard winter. The boys practiced saying "sir" to Boone, eager to mimic the big man's ways, their small voices shy and proud. They helped stack firewood, dragging branches with mittened hands, until Boone showed them how to split kindling with a single careful strike. Life inside the cabin settled into a rhythm, but the world beyond its walls shifted beneath their feet. Clara still woke at night, caught between dreams and dread, her hands closing over nothing but blankets. She rationed food out of habit, hiding the heel of a loaf in her apron pocket, saving bacon grease in a tin. Old tricks from a life spent ducking and scraping, never sure when the next meal might be her last. Some scars heal, some just grow quiet. Spring crept closer. The snow melted in slow, heavy drips from the eaves, exposing brown grass and old bones. With the thaw came danger. Roads clearing meant the world would come calling, and trouble found its way through mud as easy as snow. Clara could feel it like pressure in her chest, that sense of being watched. Some mornings she caught the faint smell of oil on the breeze, or the print of a boot too large for Boone's by the stable door. One evening Boone brought Clara outside, taught her how to hold a Winchester. His words were spare, his hands steady. "Breathe with it. Don't pull. Just squeeze." She'd never fired a rifle, but the metal felt good in her arms, its cold certainty something she could trust. Boone nodded when she hit the log on her 3rd try, but his eyes stayed shadowed. Roy Carter was out there. She could feel him, hungry for what he'd lost. Hutch and Smiley rode with him, both men loyal for the wrong reasons, both eager for what Roy promised. The snow that had hidden their tracks was gone. Now every tree, every path was a threat. That night, thunder rolled over the mountains. rattling loose shutters and drawing the family tight around the fire. Boone worked quietly, digging out the space beneath the kitchen floor, showing Clara where she and the children could hide if trouble found them. He built the hatch strong, the latch tight. "You hear me say down you go. Don't wait for nothing else." The air grew thick with waiting. After midnight the dogs howled again, closer now, voices echoing off the ridges. Then a fist hammered the door. Clara froze, breath caught, heart slamming in her chest. Boone moved to the entry, rifle in hand, voice deep and steady as Riverstone. "This house has a name now," he called through the wood. "And it ain't yours?" A pause, the sound of boots shifting on frozen mud, and then Roy's voice, oily and cold. "You got something belongs to me, Boone." Boone worked the lever on his rifle, the sound loud in the dark. "Ain't nothing here for you, Roy. Walk on." Another pause, then footsteps retreating, the crunch of snow under angry feet. They were gone, for now. After, Boone rested a heavy hand on Clara's shoulder, a comfort, not a claim. She felt her breath return, slow and ragged, but in the morning the world had changed. Out by the stable, the ground was charred, black with old fire. The smell of kerosene hung in the air. Beside the ashes, the print of a boot and the stub of a cigar ground out hard. Clara gripped the Winchester, the weight of it more than metal. This life would not be easy, nor the peace cheap. But as the sun crested the ridge and lit the land gold, she stood beside Boone, her children pressed to her skirts, and knew she would not run. She found the note hammered to the post with a nail long as her finger, letters slashed in black across splintered wood. "Sundown, White Pine Bridge." Clara read it twice, lips pressed tight, heart beating quick and light as a sparrow trapped beneath the ribs. She knew Roy's hand and his meaning. This wasn't invitation, it was sentence. The old fear came back sharp and cold, whispering that the past did not lose its teeth just because she dared to take a new name. She tried to write Boone a letter, scratched out half a page, telling him not to follow. Tore it up, started again, tore that too. In the end, she left only a line on the kitchen table, "Don't bleed for me," and set her jaw against the trembling. Boone, she knew, would read between the lines. He always did. Before leaving, Clara pressed the willow ring to her lips. She tucked a knife in her boot, another in her sleeve, and kissed each child as if it might be the last. She walked alone toward the bridge, snow slick underfoot, the air thick with the smell of thaw and threat. The land here was raw, young, streams rushing with meltwater, cottonwoods budding pale green. She moved as if through water, memories crowding close. Roy's laugh when drunk, the snap of his belt, the soft whimper of a child too young to know why he had to be silent. She saw him waiting on the far side of the bridge, Hutch lurking behind, the wind flicking smoke from their cigarettes. Roy leaned back against a post, rifle across his lap, mouth curling into a smile that never touched his eyes. "Thought you'd come crawling," he called. "Girl like you don't last long on her own." Clara stopped in the center of the bridge, boots planted wide, chin lifted so her fear would not show. "I'm not yours anymore," she said, voice steady as she could make it. Roy's grin sharpened. "You were mine the minute I broke you, and you stayed mine when I buried your name. I always get what I'm owed." Hutch stepped forward, shotgun dangling from one hand, eyes slick and bright. Clara slid her fingers to her boot, found the knife. Her pulse thudded in her ears, and for a moment she felt she'd never breathe right again. Roy didn't see Boone until it was too late. A shadow cut loose from the trees, moving silent as snowmelt. Boone's fist crashed into Roy's jaw, knocking him sideways. Hutch raised his shotgun, but Clara lunged, knife flashing, catching him across the thigh. He yelped, dropped his weapon, scrambled back as Boone grappled Roy to the ground. The fight was short and ugly, boots skidding on wet boards, curses ripped raw from the throat. In the end, Boone stood over Roy, chest heaving, hands bloodied but eyes steady. Roy, gasping, spat at the planks. One leg twisted beneath him. "You stay away from this family," Boone said, voice gravel and steel, "or next time you won't get up." Clara stood, shaking, knife red at the tip. She met Boone's eyes. No words, just the knowledge that something had changed. Not finished, but changed. They left Roy on the bridge, his curses fading into the wind. The snow began to fall again, soft and relentless, covering the blood and the boot prints. Clara and Boone walked home in silence, hearts beating together, steps measured and sure. But back at the cabin, Clara saw the storm building on the horizon, black as old memories. She knew this peace would not hold, not yet, not with Roy still breathing, his hate as constant as winter. Night closed in sharp and sudden, the mountains swallowing the last of the pale day. Boone guided Clara and the children up a narrow track toward Bear Creek Gorge, a place where the rock walls pressed close and a cold wind never stopped moving. The cabin behind them, warm for a heartbeat, seemed already distant, a memory in the making. Boone limped slightly, old pain flaring up in his leg with every step. He kept a hand near his rifle, eyes scanning the shadows where fox and man both knew how to disappear. Clara carried Caleb, his cheeks fever warm against her neck. The boys trudged silent, sensing that this journey was not a game. Boone led them to the mouth of a cave, half hidden by fallen pine and drifted snow. Inside, the darkness was thick and close, but Boone quickly sparked a lamp, and the golden light stretched just far enough to push the fear back to the edges. Food was low. Water had to be melted from packed snow, and every sound outside seemed louder than it should. The children huddled near the fire, watching the adults with wide, knowing eyes. Clara laid Caleb on a pelt and tried to ignore the rattle in his chest, the cough that would not quiet. She remembered nights in Roy's house, how silence meant danger there, but here it only meant waiting. Boone checked the perimeter, laying out old traps and stringing a wire of tiny bells across the brush. He moved with care, though his limp had worsened, sweat shining on his brow. When he returned, he handed Clara a handful of snares. "Rabbits all we'll catch tonight. Show Jesse and Noah how to set 'em. Quiet hands, soft steps." Outside, the wind howled, but inside the cave they became a small country unto themselves. Boone propped himself by the entrance, carving another toy, but every so often his eyes flickered to the dark, searching for what he could not see. Clara bandaged his leg, hands gentle but efficient, saying little. Pain was a familiar thing, something neither pitied nor named. Then, late, the wire bells clattered in the dark. Boone jerked upright, reached for his rifle, but before he could stand, a shot rang out, loud and close. Clara dropped flat, pulling the boys beneath the pelts. Boone crawled towards the mouth of the cave and fired back, the report echoing up the gorge. Another shot cracked. Boone grunted, fell back, clutching his thigh. Blood welled bright between his fingers. Clara did not scream. She moved to him, tearing strips from her underskirt to staunch the wound, pressing hard as Boone's jaw clenched and his breath rasped. "Not deep," he muttered, though sweat slicked his face and the world wavered in his eyes. The shooting stopped. Whoever was out there, Hutch or Smiley or both, had retreated for now, satisfied to wound and wait. The children slept uneasy, and Boone faded in and out, his hand finding Clara's in the dark. The pain was sharp, but the silence between them was gentle, softened by necessity, by survival, by something like hope. In the blue dawn, ice dripped from the cave's mouth. Boone's fever broke, though his leg throbbed angry and hot. Clara watched him sleep. exhaustion tugging at her bones, but her mind restless. Outside, the storm had passed, but the threat remained, silent, patient, waiting for another chance. When Boone finally opened his eyes, he found Clara sitting beside him, her hair tangled, her eyes dark with worry but unbroken. She pressed a tin cup of melted snow to his lips, and for the first time she let her hand rest on his cheek, brief and wordless, a promise spoken without sound. Beyond the cave, the land waited, cold and wide, but for one long moment the wound inside her chest stilled. By the time they returned to Boone's ranch in the valley, spring was a rumor in the air, but the earth was still hard, and the snow that lingered in the shade carried the memory of old violence. The Anima's homestead looked the same as it ever had. Split-rail fences, a crooked barn, the field stubbled with last season's corn. But to Clara, it was both shelter and test. She paused at the gate, the boys crowding around her as if afraid the ground itself might open and swallow them back into wandering. Boone said little. He guided them into the house, shoulders slumped with pain, but his steps steady. Inside, the air was thick with wood smoke and the faint metallic scent of old blood. Boone leaned his rifle by the door, checked the windows and the latches without a word. Clara helped the boys remove their boots, warmed their hands by the stove. For a while there was only the familiar sound of a kettle, the scrape of spoons, and the slow, deep breaths of people trying to believe in safety. But fear was an old habit. Clara watched Boone's every movement, listening for the snap in his voice that never came. The children flinched at sudden noises, at the bark of the dog or the groan of the wind, only to find Boone's hand gentle on their shoulders, his patience something steady as the earth beneath them. That night, Boone set out extra feed for the animals, raked coals beneath the stove, and left the door barred. Clara woke to the smell of smoke, not the comforting haze of hearth fire, but the sharp, wild stink of burning hay. She ran to the window. Flames leapt from the barn, orange and alive, shadows flickering wild across the yard. Boone was already moving, pulling on boots, hauling buckets to the well. "Stay with the boys," he called, but Clara did not hide. She grabbed the rifle, pressed the children into the corner, and watched the door, breath ragged in her chest. Through the crackling heat, she saw movement. A shape slipping between fire and shadow. Roy, his face lit by the blaze, grinning, Smiley beside him laughing as he tossed a second lantern through the barn window. Boone shouted, swung a bucket, drove them back with curses. Clara raised the rifle, sighted on Roy as he circled the yard. Her hands shook, but her finger was steady. She fired once, twice. The shots cracked through the chaos. Roy ducked, stumbled, vanished into the trees. Smiley dropped his lantern and ran. When the fire burned low, Boone dragged what was left of the barn's charred frame into a pile. Together in silence, he and Clara dug a shallow grave beneath the willow tree by the creek. There, with no words, they buried Roy Carter. Not for love, not for hate, but because the land required it. There was no marker, no prayer, just a handful of earth and a long, aching quiet. In the pale morning, Clara washed her face in the creek, feeling the cold water bite her skin and wondering if anything would ever grow here again. On the gate, a fresh sheet of paper flapped in the wind, pinned there by an iron spike. Boone read it, jaw tight. The words were printed clear. "This land belongs to Denver and Rio Grande by grant of the railroad. 21 days to vacate." Boone let the notice fall. The law had found them at last, as relentless as winter, as cold as any enemy. The boys woke hungry, not yet understanding the shape of the new threat. Clara poured their porridge, her hands steady, her eyes on the window. The battle for home was not over. It had only shifted form. The world of men with guns was harsh, but the world of men with paper could be colder still. Clara followed Boone into Ouray, the county seat. Half a day's ride in the wagon with the boys jostling in back, Caleb's small fists gripping her skirt. The town itself sat low in the valley, framed by jagged peaks and melting drifts, mud and slush swallowing boot prints and wagon ruts. At the center stood the land office, a boxy wooden building that stank of ink and mildew, a place where words could steal what blood had built. Inside, the walls were lined with old deeds, names written by men long dead. Boone's broad figure seemed out of place beneath the flickering lamp, his hat brushing the doorframe. Clara held the baby tight, her heart pounding as she watched a clerk, thin, sharp-chinned, eyes like a hawk, thumb through a ledger with stained fingers. Next to him, a man in a greasy coat, Foreman Pike, oozed a smile that never warmed his face. "Claims invalid," the clerk said, not bothering to look up. "Land was sold by a man didn't own it. Railroad deed trumps any squatter's rights. 21 days to move on or the sheriff will see to it." Boone didn't argue. He just listened, jaw clenching tight. Clara stared at her shoes, feeling shame rise hot behind her eyes. All their labor, every cut and bruise, every breath drawn in hope, all of it could vanish with a stamp and a signature. But Boone didn't leave. Instead, he asked flat, "There a way to fight it?" The clerk shrugged. "Homestead law's clear. 60 days habitation and clear improvement, plus a sworn witness. You got proof? Bring it. Otherwise, my hands are tied." Foreman Pike leaned in, his smile twisting. "You folks should cut your losses. Railroad'll be running right through that hollow by winter. Best to move while you still got something to haul." Boone ignored him. He turned to Clara. "We'll find proof." They left, boots echoing in the empty street. That night, Sister Agnes at the church offered a narrow cot and a bowl of soup, letting the children sleep in a line along the wall. The air smelled of candle wax and bread and the ache of old sorrow. Clara lay awake, listening to the creak of floorboards and the whisper of prayers drifting from the sanctuary. A note arrived at dawn, pressed into Boone's hand by a messenger on a tired bay. The handwriting was cramped but clear. "Lieutenant Ranger Jed Crowley. I'll be up the mountain come sunrise to inspect. Bring witness, bring records." Clara tucked the note into her apron, hope and fear tangled tight in her chest. There was no sleep after that, only the slow gathering of resolve, the knowledge that a home must be fought for, not just with bullets, but with every piece of truth you could hold up to the light. Boone sat by the window, sharpening his knife, silent as a stone. Clara watched him, the ring of willow still warm on her finger, and knew that no law could measure what it cost to stay. The boys woke hungry and laughing, and for a little while the world shrank to a spoonful of porridge and the hush of dawn. But outside, the clouds pressed low and heavy, and the road back to the ranch waited, slick with uncertainty. Boone's leg ached as he rode up the switchbacks behind the ranger, every jolt in the saddle digging into old scars. Crowley, the lawman, rode ahead, a big man in a battered coat, face lined by wind and work, saying little as the horses picked their way through the thaw. Beside them, Winslow Hale, the county's young scribe, hunched over his notepad, hat askew, eyes sharp and nervous. The mountains glistened with snowmelt, streams running fast and cold through the shadows of aspen and pine. As they neared the homestead, Boone's gaze caught on a small pair of shoes, dangling from the wash line, drying in the pale sun. They belonged to Jesse, the youngest of the twins, and for a moment Boone's chest tightened, the memory of his own lost boy flashing sharp and bitter. He pressed on, jaw set, not looking back. The homestead lay battered by winter but standing, a crooked barn with half its roof burned, chicken coop rebuilt from scraps, a vegetable patch marked by muddy rows and hope. Clara waited on the porch. The boys clustered around her, faces wary but proud. Boone dismounted slow, biting back a groan, and nodded at Crowley. The ranger stepped through the gate, boots leaving deep prints. He moved with purpose, inspecting the barn's charred frame, the hand-cut posts the well Clara and Boone had dug in fall. Winslow scribbled in his book, measuring with a length of twine, jotting numbers, sketching rough lines of fences and sheds. Crowley bent to study the ground, then the water channel Boone had cut to bring melt off the ridge. "You keep this running?" he asked, not unkindly. "Most days," Boone replied. "Drought or not, we work it." Winslow squinted at the smokehouse where deer skins hung drying. "Children live here full-time?" Clara stepped forward, chin up. "We built this together. My boys sleep safe under that roof." "No one else's name on it but ours." The ranger nodded, moving slow but thorough. As he passed the old willow, his hand brushed the fresh mound of earth, Roy Carter's resting place. He didn't ask. Maybe he knew the shape of violence too well to need the story told. Out by the edge of the woodlot, a shadow shifted. Boone tensed, hand drifting toward his sidearm. Hutch lingered there, face gaunt, eyes hollow with hunger and rage. For a heartbeat, the world hung on a thread. Boone did not raise his gun. He only said, "Enough, Hutch. You ain't welcome here." Hutch glared, spat, and melted back into the trees, defeated not by threat, but by the simple weight of Boone's voice. The sun began to drop behind the ridges. Crowley scratched at his beard. "You folks got scars, but you got roots, too. I seen worse passed off as homestead. Clerk'll want proof, but you got mine." Winslow nodded, tucking his notepad into his vest. "We'll file the report. Officer Rowan'll decide." Boone mounted up slow, every muscle stiff. Crowley gave him a look, half warning, half respect. "You fought for this place, Boone. Fight ain't done, but I'd rather have you as neighbor than enemy." They rode back down the mountain, dusk laying a purple hush over the land. Boone glanced once over his shoulder. At the house, the willow tree, the wavering smoke from the stovepipe. He thought of the lives buried there, and the ones still growing. At the valley's edge, Crowley paused, hat in hand. "You're not squatters. You're settlers. Hope the law sees it the same." Boone said nothing. He didn't have to. Some things in the West were proven not by word, but by the work of your hands and what you refused to leave behind. The land office in Ouray was built of thick pine and hope, but the hope faded at the edges, stained by coffee rings and sweat. Clara stepped inside with Boone beside her, the boys left in the care of Sister Agnes at the church. Her hands sweated through her gloves, clutching the worn folder of notes and rough drawings. Every scrap of proof that their home was more than just a mark on a stolen map. Amos Rowan, the land officer, sat behind a desk stacked with ledgers. He looked like a man carved from an old tree. Gray, knotted, eyes rimmed red from too many hard winters. He barely glanced up. "Name?" he asked. "Clara Boone," she answered, steady as she could. She slid the folder across the desk. Rowan thumbed through it, his face a mask. He saw photos, muddy boots by a fire, the vegetable patch in a wash of morning sun, Boone and the boys standing in a row, tools slung over shoulders. He paused on a page torn from a Bible, a list of names, birth dates, the careful, spidery print of someone learning to claim what was theirs. "You got witnesses?" Rowan asked flat. Boone nodded. Crowley the ranger, Winslow the clerk, both saw it. Rowan leaned back, jaw working. "Railroad lawyer says you're trespassers. Foreman Pike's been in twice a week, swearing up and down this claim is fraud." Clara felt the heat rise in her chest. She remembered Roy's voice, the way men like Pike could twist the law, the way Roy twisted arms. She fought the urge to beg. Boone spoke, his words few but iron. "We didn't steal it. We built it. Every fence post, every cut of wood. Ask the neighbors if you doubt it." Rowan's eyes flickered just for a second. He pressed a heavy stamp into the pad, holding it aloft, paused. "Swear it," he said. Clara stood straight, voice clear. "I swear by every name I've written here. I worked that land, I fed my boys on it. I buried a man who meant us harm, and I mean to raise them free." Boone put a calloused hand on her shoulder, grounding her in the room. Crowley stepped forward from the corner, silent until now. "I watched them. I watched what they lost, what they made." Rowan set his stamp down, slow, deliberate, heavy. "I'll send a deputy for final inspection. If the story matches what's on this page, deed goes in your name, Mrs. Boone." Clara's knees threatened to buckle. Boone steadied her, thumb tracing the edge of her sleeve. Rowan handed her a slip. Nothing but a promise, but it felt like a victory pulled from the jaws of something far older and colder than the law. They left the office together, the air outside raw and sweet, spring running in the gutter. Clara pressed the paper to her chest, unsure if she should cry or laugh or pray. She felt Boone's presence beside her, not a wall but a windbreak, something strong enough to lean against, but not so strong it cast a shadow. That night Clara knelt beside the boys, watched Boone sip coffee by the window, and listened as the rain changed to snow. For the first time in years she believed the future might belong to her, not to the ghosts that followed. But the law had its pace, and the final word was not yet written. The first break in the weather came, like a promise. Ice shrinking back from the river stones, the Cimarron's muddy water, running clear for the first time in months. Boone stood knee-deep in the chilly flow, driving a post with the flat of his axe, his breath steaming. Clara hauled buckets up from the bank, sleeves rolled, hair loose and wild. The boys splashed underfoot, muddy and laughing, their boots leaking but their spirits high. They weren't just waiting anymore, they were proving. The land had to show its worth to the law, and the law had to see it with its own two eyes. Crowley, the ranger, arrived just past dawn, Winslow trailing behind, a clipboard in hand and boots already wet. He watched as Boone repaired the bridge at the edge of the property, nails clamped in his teeth, hands quick and sure. He saw Clara coax the goats back into the pen, heard her quiet voice as she soothed Caleb when he stumbled. "Had a rough go of it," Crowley said to Boone, watching him lever a stone into place in the dam that kept the irrigation running. "But you didn't leave." Boone didn't answer. He didn't have to. The inspection ran long. Winslow took notes on every improvement, the fresh wood on the coop, the dugout cellar, the cabbage sprouts already fighting their way up through the cold mud. He asked to see the well, the smokehouse, the patch of potatoes where Jesse and Noah knelt in the dirt, showing off fat earthworms. Clara brewed coffee and poured it into tin cups, her hands steady for the first time in a season. When the sky went gray and the rain started, Boone and Clara worked through it, hauling mud from the channel, shoring up the path that the runoff tried to wash away. The boys formed a bucket line, laughing as water sloshed over their sleeves, proud to be part of something that held the land together. Crowley watched, nodded, scratched a note in his book. "You got something most folks never find," he told Boone quietly, "a reason to stay." Evening settled with a cold wind, but the cabin glowed warm from within. Boone pressed a tin cup into Clara's hands. "Drink, you done enough for a week?" Clara took the cup, sipped, let her shoulders fall. The ache in her back was the honest kind, earned by work and not fear. In the hush that followed, Crowley finished his notes, looked Boone and Clara in the eye. "I'll sign what needs signing. You've made this place more than a mark on a map." Winslow stamped his muddy boots, smiling tired. "Deed'll have your name, Mrs. Boone, if Rowan's true to his word." As they left for town in the early dark, Clara watched the river run, the land washed clean. For a moment she saw the place not as a fortress or a grave, but as a home. Tomorrow the paper would decide. Tonight the wind was gentle and the world, just for a heartbeat, was quiet. The courthouse in Ouray stood at the edge of town, a squat building of stone and wood, its porch worn by boots and weather and hope. Clara walked up the steps with Boone beside her. The boys clustered around Sister Agnes, who kept them in a circle of calm, singing softly as they waited in the spring sunlight. The sky was a patchwork of clouds and blue, wind stirring the banners over the door. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old paper and nervous sweat. Rowan waited at the counter, ledger open, his eyes tired but kind. Clara handed over the folder, names, dates, sketches, Crowley's signature at the bottom. Boone said nothing, just stood behind her, a silent mountain of patience and resolve. Rowan paged through the records one last time. "It's all here," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Proof enough for the law and plenty more for any man with sense." He set the ledger before Clara, dipped his pen, nodded. "Sign your name, Mrs. Boone. This land's yours if you claim it." Her hand shook, but she pressed the pen to the paper, letters slow and careful. Clara May Boone. The ink bled just a little, the weight of it sinking into the page. Boone added his own mark, blunt and clear, a man who'd never wasted words on ceremony. A murmur passed through the small crowd in the hall, neighbors, a few ranchers, even Foreman Pike hanging at the edge, scowling. Rowan dried the signature, stamped the paper hard, and slid it across the counter. Clara picked it up, unable to breathe. For a moment, the world spun. All those years of running, all the nights awake in fear, all the work and the loss, boiled down to this, a name on a deed, a line that meant home. Boone caught her as her knees softened, steadying her with one hand. He didn't grip, didn't squeeze, just held her up, patient as always. Clara blinked, fighting tears, clutching the paper to her chest. Sister Agnes ushered the boys in, her eyes bright. "Your mama did it," she said, voice high and proud. The boys circled Clara, arms around her waist and shoulders, noisy and warm, the kind of chaos that felt like victory. Outside, the sun came out from behind the clouds, gold on the courthouse steps. Clara let herself stand still, face lifted, eyes closed. Boone stood beside her, not saying a word. He didn't need to. They walked home slow, the wagon rattling over the ruts, the deed clutched tight in Clara's lap. Every bump, every jolt was a reminder. This place was theirs now, not because the law said so, but because they had built it, survived it, made it hold. Back at the homestead, the land waited, muddy, battered but alive. Clara stood on the porch, watching the wind move over the fields, and felt the earth shift beneath her feet. Not running, not hiding, but staying. That night, Boone poured coffee for them both, sat beside her in the quiet, and listened to the song of frogs in the creek. For the first time, Clara slept deep, the deed tucked under her pillow, the boys breathing steady in their beds. Home was not just a place. It was the sound of her name, spoken with care, written in black ink, ringing through every room. Spring came slow and stubborn to the valley, green fighting its way up through the blackened mud where last year's fire had burned. Clara knelt in the garden, fingers sunk deep in the cold earth, planting potatoes and cabbage in neat rows, her apron streaked with soil. Boone moved along the roofline, hammering new shingles in place, pausing to wipe sweat from his brow and watch her in the low sunlight. The sound of his work was steady and strong, as if each strike was a promise. We will stay, we will build, we will not be moved. The boys ran wild between the coop and the woodshed, laughter sharp as blue jays, boots splashing through puddles. Jesse stopped to help Clara drop a seed, his small hands clumsy but eager. Noah chased chickens across the yard, his shouts scattering them like leaves in a gale. Even Caleb, toddling at Clara's side, dug a fistful of dirt and grinned, face smeared with joy. But some things would not wash clean. At night, Clara woke tangled in her sheets, heart pounding at phantom footsteps on the porch, the echo of Roy's boots in the halls of memory. Boone found her one morning staring out the window at dawn, arms wrapped tight around her chest. "You're not running," he said, voice gentle. "You're here, with us." Clara nodded, but the wound in her chest felt fresh and raw. She turned back to her work, letting the dirt and the ache settle together in the furrows. Storms came early, pounding rain on the roof, wind tearing at the doors. One night, a fox broke into the coop, scattering feathers and panic. Boone and Jessie patched the fence by lantern light, hands numb with cold, eyes sharp for trouble. Another night, Clara heard movement in the trees, a figure at the edge of the clearing watching from the dark. It was Hutch, the last ghost of that bitter past, hunger and anger in every line of his face. Clara gripped the Winchester, but Boone stopped her with a word. "Enough!" Crowley appeared on the trail, lawman's badge glinting. "This land's not for the taking, Hutch." "Time you moved on." The figure melted into the trees, never to return. That night, after the storm passed, the family gathered around a small fire in the yard. Tin cups clinking, boots muddy and hearts lighter. Ollie, youngest and boldest, looked up at Boone, voice soft in the hush. "We have to leave again, Pa." Boone met Clara's gaze, his answer brief and heavy as stone. "I will not leave." The words hung in the air, a vow made not to the world, but to each other. Clara felt her chest loosen, the ache easing. She reached for Boone's hand, calloused, strong, real. In the gray light of morning, Clara found green shoots pushing up through the ashes where the fire had raged. She knelt and touched them, mud cold beneath her nails, and let herself hope. In the house, Boone finished carving a cradle for Caleb, the wood smooth beneath his fingers. Clara stood in the doorway, watching, her heart full of old hurt and new peace. For the first time, she believed that wounds could close, not disappear, but close, when someone cared enough to stay. Summer laid its heat over the valley, grass grown high and soft. Along the wagon ruts, dust rising in golden spirals behind the boys' bare feet. The windmill clattered steady in the sun, its blades turning slow, pulling water from the deep places below. Clara stood at the porch rail, her hands stained with flour and earth, watching Jessie and Noah chase the hens through the yard, their laughter sparking like fireflies in the morning air. Boone was out by the well, sleeves rolled, repairing the pump with Ollie holding the toolbox, the quiet talk between them easy and sure. Caleb napped in the cradle Boone had made, the baby's fist curled around a loop of willow. Life hummed around the house, clothes snapping on the line, a pan of biscuits baking slow in the oven, coffee brewing dark and strong on the back of the stove. In the cool shadow of the kitchen, Clara wiped her hands and turned to a small pair of shoes on the mantel, Boone's lost child's, worn smooth by time. He'd never spoken of the storm that took his family, not with words, but one morning he placed the shoes in Clara's hands, his eyes tired and open. "Some things you never bury deep enough," he said, voice rough, "but you learn to let someone carry the weight with you." She held them close, the old pain mingling with her own. "I hear you," she answered, not needing more. There were days the past still pressed in, the sound of thunder rolling down the valley, a letter from the church, news of the railroad changing course, skirting their land and leaving the valley quiet. Sister Agnes visited with seeds and stories. The lawman Crowley stopped by with a nod, leaving behind the news that the danger had passed. Boone took his name off the door, carved all 6 names deep into the porch rail, each letter a small defiance against forgetting. In the evenings, as the sun bled out across the grass, Boone brought Clara a cup of coffee, the mug warm in her hands. They sat together on the steps, boots side by side, the hush of contentment settling around them like a blanket. The boys dozed in a heap on the porch, Caleb snuffling in his cradle, the dog sprawled at their feet. Sometimes the silence was heavy, filled with memory and longing. Sometimes it was light, a gift given with nothing expected in return. Boone would reach out, touch her shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of her collarbone, steady, grounding, real. No speeches, no declarations, just the quiet truth of two people who had learned, through pain and patience, to stay. Morning would come, as it always did. The windmill would spin, the chickens would cluck and scatter. Clara would kneel in the garden, Boone would split wood for the winter ahead, and the boys would run until their laughter carried all the way to the distant pines. And when the world pressed in again, as it surely would, Clara knew now. She was not alone with her wound. Boone stood with her, silent but never absent. Their story was not perfect, but it was theirs. Carved into wood, written in black coffee and green shoots, held together by the rough and tender work of staying. On the porch the morning light caught the names carved deep. No song, no sermon, just the long shadows of the family reaching out together into a day that at last belonged only to them. If this story moved you, drop a simple 1 in the comments so we know you're here with us. Hit subscribe for more true grit and wild hearts from the Old West. Don't miss the next story. Sometimes the quietest folks have the strongest scars.